When we think of England, we see a land stretching from the southern coast of Britain to the northern reaches of Hadrian's Wall on the border with Scotland. It is a land with common laws, customs, and language. However, if you were to travel back into the 9th century, this would not be the case. In fact, what we think of as England at this time was ruled by two separate kings, one of Anglo-Saxon origin and one part of a band of invading Scandinavian warriors known as Vikings. Later, in the 10th century, the English King Edgar passed a rule that said all Danes living in England could exercise their rights by their own laws. In the 11th century, this area came to be known as Danelaw, meaning under Danish law, and by the 12th century, it is considered an almost separate geopolitical location known simply as the Danelaw. How then did the land come to be split in two, and what were the lasting implications of this? Let's travel back to a time of raids, great warriors, and the fight for England. The Vikings first began raiding the British Isles in the late 8th century, with the infamous rampage on Holy Island in 793, sparking the beginning of the Viking Age in the British consciousness. However, it wasn't until 865 that they arrived on British shores in large enough numbers to cause a real problem. Anglo Saxon Chronicle describes the arrival of the Great Heathen Army, which referred to a large band of Scandinavian peoples numbering approximately 3,000. It has been estimated that eventually around 15 to 30,000 Scandinavian peoples would arrive in Britain over the next 14 years, landing their boats on the East Anglian coast. They were not here merely to raid and return to their homelands, like the many fleeting summers prior, where they sought out the wealthy monasteries. These peoples were determined to conquer. Led by 3 of the 5 sons of the legendary Viking leader Ragnar Lodbrok, they were said to be out for revenge at the death of their father, who it was said was thrown into a pit of venomous snakes by the King of Northumbria. They quickly captured York and the surrounding area. Their conquered lands would eventually increase to include Mercian towns such as Nottingham, despite strong opposition from King Ethelred of Wessex and his brother Alfred. The ruler of Mercia, King Burgred, eventually agreed a peace deal with Ivar the Boneless, which saw them keep Nottingham in exchange for peace in the rest of Mercia. In the early 870s, the Danes would claim East Anglia by defeating King Edmund at Hoxne. As the Danes edged closer to Wessex, brothers Ethelred and Alfred fought to hold them back. In 871, they defeated the Danish army at the Battle of Ashdown and forced the Danes back into Hampshire. However, Ivar pushed back and the brothers were defeated on 2 more occasions. When Ethelred died in April 871, he left a weak army for his brother Alfred to inherit. Knowing this, and that fighting the Danes was futile, Alfred knew the only way to subdue the threat was to pay them off. Due to this, Ivar and the Danes returned to raiding in Mercia. Ivar would die during this campaign and was succeeded by Guthrum, who was ultimately successful in taking Mercia by 874. In little over 10 years, the Danes had taken East Anglia, Northumbria, and now Mercia. Only Wessex remained. Over the next few years, Guthrum and Alfred fought battle after battle against each other, each taking 1 step forward and 1 back. By the late 870s, they had both come to the conclusion that fighting wasn't the way forward. In 878, Alfred defeated Guthrum at Edington, and under the terms of surrender, an agreement over land was made. Alfred would allow Guthrum and the Danes to keep some of the lands they had gained control in, under the condition that Guthrum convert to Christianity by being baptized. Guthrum agreed and was duly baptized, with Alfred acting as godfather. Sometime after this, and before Guthrum's death in 890, the agreement was formally written down. Dubbed the Treaty of Alfred and Guthrum, it divided England up into 2 halves. Alfred and Wessex would have the southern area, and Guthrum and the Danes the north. Unlike Hadrian's Wall or Offa's Dyke before it, there would be no physical boundary. The treaty tells us, first, as to the boundaries between us, they shall run up the Thames, and then up the Lee, and along the Lee to its source, then in a straight line to Bedford, and then up the Ouse to Watling Street. Watling Street was the old Roman road which started in southeast England and ended near Wroxeter in Mercia. Roughly speaking, from London to Chester today. Anything south of it was Alfred's, and anything to the north, Guthrum's. The Danelaw was made up of 5 boroughs: Leicester, Nottingham, Derby, Stamford and Lincoln. These were fortified towns and therefore strategically important to the Danes. You might be wondering if people could move between the Danelaw and Wessex, or to other areas. The treaty allowed for passage between the two for trade, on condition that hostages are given as security for peaceful behaviour. How strict this was adhered to is not known. It is safe to say that trade would have been commonplace. During the 890s, a Norwegian merchant called Othre was able to travel to the court of King Alfred and was afforded an audience with the king, so there was clearly no issue with travelling between the areas, or seems to be any hostility shown towards Scandinavians during this time. That isn't to say that no violence happened during this period, but it was far less violent than the preceding decades. Culturally, the Danelaw would have seemed somewhat different. However, the Scandinavian settlers would have quickly acculturated to English ways and beliefs. That is not to say that everyone became a devout Christian on their arrival, as we know many still worship the old gods as well as having Christian beliefs. And although Christianity eventually won out, the Scandinavian influence is still felt in the area to this day. Many place names in the north of England and East Midlands have endings such as How, meaning village, or Thorpe, meaning hamlet, and 4 of the 5 boroughs also became modern-day county towns. It is doubtful that many living in these areas today would class themselves as Vikings, but perhaps they share as much in common with the Scandinavians of the Danelaw as they do with the Anglo-Saxons of that period.